competition of the history of a men's World Cup.
Curaçao with its 150,000 inhabitants, Cape Verde with barely 600,000 souls, and Bosnia with its 3 million citizens. Have we ever seen a World Cup with so many tiny nations? A World Cup with so many tiny countries that have fewer inhabitants than some global metropolises? Honestly, I don't think so. And that's normal because this year, for the first time, it's not 32 but 48 teams competing in the biggest World Cup in history. Except that when we look at this long list of 48 qualified countries, we realize that two major countries are missing, two countries that are giants in terms of population size or even economic power, and yet despite representing more than a quarter of the world's population, together they have only a single World Cup qualification in their history: India and China. So how can we explain this? Why are the world's two most populous countries so bad at football, even though, despite common misconceptions, at the beginning of the 20th century, these two nations were major pillars of continental football in Asia? Well, that's exactly what I investigated to understand, by retracing their history and analyzing their culture. And you'll see these are probably two of the biggest cases of self-sabotage in the history of sports. Honestly, everything that happened is pretty surreal, so make yourself comfortable. Here we go, intro. Make yourself comfortable. You should know that when I started thinking about this topic, about this potential video, when I noticed this anomaly, well, the first answer that came to mind to explain China's and India's terrible weakness in football was, in my mind, the lack of history and culture around football in both countries. Except that very quickly, well, I realized that this preconceived idea was completely wrong. Because contrary to what people think, you should know that India and China started playing football very early on. In fact, at the end of the 19th century, while Europe was swept up in the frenzy of football, the sport quickly arrived in India via British soldiers. At the time, just to remind you, India was a British colony, and so, through some soldiers sent to India for a few months, people started playing football there, and very quickly, it spread to the local population. As early as 1888, a competition was established, the Durand Cup, which is actually the third oldest football competition. 5 years later, a federation was even established. In short, Calcutta, the Indian capital, quickly became the nerve center of continental and Asian football, while India, for its part, was one of the first countries on the continent, and even in the world, to truly organize football and its practice. And what's funny is that for China, well, it's going to be almost the same story. Through Hong Kong, which was then a British colony, as well as certain cities like Shanghai and Tianjin where the British Empire had concessions, the Chinese would also discover football very quickly, a sport that would appeal to students and the elite. As a result, teams began to appear in universities and colleges, and by the first decades of the 20th century, football had become one of the most popular sports in the country. In fact, the Chinese national team won the Far Eastern Championship games 9 times between 1915 and 1934. So as you can see, everything started off very well. Everything started off at full speed for Chinese football, which even joined FIFA as early as 1931, but unfortunately, soon after, everything fell apart. The reason was bloody regional and then civil wars, which distanced the Middle Kingdom from football to the point that it even withdrew from FIFA in 1958. However, for Indian football, despite a similar outcome to China, the story and path will be completely different. Because in this case, the Bhangra boys will achieve remarkable success on the international stage. While football became, at the beginning of the 20th century, a major tool for political emancipation for Indians still under British rule, the country's independence would allow for the creation of a true national team that quickly made a splash. At the 1948 Olympics in London, the barefoot Indians caused a stir by losing only 2-1 against the French team, and then went on to thrash several of the continent's top teams in friendly matches, such as Ajax Amsterdam, whom they defeated 5-1. And yes, in fact, under the guidance of their coach Syed Abdul Rahim, those who were nicknamed the Brazilians of Asia would experience a true golden age. Following those 1948 Olympics, the Indians went on to win the gold medal at the Asian Games a year later, notably defeating Japan and South Korea. And similarly, in 1956, the team even reached the semi-finals of the Olympics after notably knocking out Australia, and in 1964 finished as runners-up in Asia. And then suddenly, just like with China, nothing more except for a very long barren spell. Because despite China's historic qualification for the 2002 World Cup, A participation that incidentally ended with 3 defeats. Our 2 global giants, despite the early 20th century promises, would go on to string together poor performances starting from the 1950s, suffering increasingly humiliating defeats over the decades, to the point that today they have completely vanished from the global football scene. So, the question you're likely asking right now is why? Why did everything collapse, and why have these 2 global giants never recovered? Why, among 3 billion people, has there not been a single star, a single football genius emerging? It's mind-boggling. And you'll see that in both cases there are several reasons that can explain this. To begin with, it is important to note that whether it's for India or for China, actually, at the very moment when football could have truly taken root in the country's culture, there was a specific major historical event that took place. Something that took football's place and completely changed the course of history forever. So, starting with China, you'll see, it's actually quite clear and remarkably easy to understand. In fact, when Mao came to power in 1949, sport became a tool of the state. In this case, the Chinese state was extremely strategic. It didn't invest in sports popular among the public like football. Instead, it chose to invest in sports that bring medals and visibility at the Olympics, and especially in disciplines where only one thing matters to win: technical repetition over and over again to master a movement to perfection. And that's how China became excellent in diving, weightlifting, table tennis, and gymnastics. These are sports where it's possible to isolate a child with good abilities and teach them for years and years a perfect technique, thus potentially producing an Olympic champion. These are disciplines in which talent is measurable, reproducible, and can be planned. And that's exactly what China started doing from the 1950s onward through its Rugotizi system, which literally means the whole country working toward a single goal. And in fact, the problem is that this system, which is absolutely formidable for individual sports, is almost useless for football. Because football can't be taught in a closed academy. Creativity, collective intelligence, reading the game, these are things that are developed through football that isn't necessarily organized, through chaotic football played in the street or in schoolyards. And that's something the Chinese won't be able to replicate. In fact, that's why in the 2010s, when Xi Jinping decided to invest billions in training young footballers with massive infrastructure projects like the Evergrande Football School, where thousands of young Chinese kids underwent rigid and standardized training, the plan ended up being a complete flop. And for India, well, it's the same story. The break between the country and football has a specific date. So let's go back to 1950, when the national team qualified for the first World Cup in its history. Against all expectations, the Indian Football Federation announced just a few weeks before the World Cup that they were withdrawing from a competition they did not consider prestigious enough to justify sending a team to Brazil. For them, the Olympic Games were much more important, much more glorious than a World Cup, which they saw as just a secondary tournament of lesser importance. Except that this refusal would take on some pretty wild proportions. Because afterwards, due to their late withdrawal in 1950, FIFA logically decided to ban India from participating in the qualifiers for the 1954 World Cup. But the real problem was that it wouldn't stop there at all, because in the weeks and years that followed, deeply dissatisfied with FIFA's decision, the AIFF would retaliate with a move as spectacular as it was self-destructive, by deciding not to participate at all in the World Cup qualifiers between 1954 and 1986. Yeah, 30 years. 3 decades without a World Cup. It's hard to realize how crazy that decision was. Plus, making this choice when you have one of the best generations in your country's history. Honestly, it's the biggest own goal in the history of football. In the long run, this will have huge negative consequences for the country and its fans. Loving a sport requires top-tier matches, great performances, and facing world-class opponents to keep your football interesting, experience big moments, and create memories with your sport. And in this case, that's just not going to happen at all. Especially since at the same time there's a sport, a team that will take advantage of this gaping void left by football. Cricket, whose Indian team will dominate everything by winning in 1983 and moreover in the United Kingdom, the former colonizer, the Cricket World Cup, thus definitively shifting the hearts of hundreds of millions of Indians toward the bat and ball sport. So much so that despite the fact that 3 years after this triumph, aware of its mistake, the federation finally ended the boycott of World Cup qualifiers, well, it was too late. The gap football had fallen behind cricket could no longer be closed. Indian football shot itself in the foot. By the way, to give you some numbers and back this up, in 2023, cricket accounted for more than 80% of the country's televised sports audience. 80%, which notably led the Indian government to reduce the budget allocated to the Football Federation from $3.6 million to just $500,000, citing the national team's repeated poor performances. This leaves Indian football in a deadlock, a vicious circle. How can you train or find young talent across this enormous country when you have no funding, no resources, and no infrastructure? It is a vicious cycle. At this point in the video, we're getting a clearer picture of the reasons why China and India are so bad at football today, but it's not over yet because there are still several factors that have played a huge role in the downward trajectories of these two countries. Among them is one factor that both countries share, and yet it's something rarely discussed: school. Because in both countries, you should know that academic pressure is extremely intense during adolescence, which is precisely when young athletes are really building their technical foundation. Because for many football development experts, it's between the ages of 12 and 16 that technical learning is truly decisive for the rest of a player's career. Except that, well, in these countries, this coincides with the age when academic demands are at their highest and most intense, especially in China, with preparation for the Gaokao, and in India with end-of-cycle exams and ultra-selective entrance exams. And so the problem is that this intense and heavy emphasis placed on exams for future prospects inevitably pushes many families to have their children prioritize their own academic success rather than football, which clearly offers very few opportunities in these countries. And in fact, this perfectly explains what the Briton Rohan Simon observed in his book Bamboo in the Penalty Area, in which he explains that after arriving in China, he created a football school there. Except that very quickly he noticed that while there are a lot of kids aged 8, 9 or even 10 who arrive full of passion and talent almost every time around the age of 12, the parents pull their children out. Not because the kids don't want to play anymore, but rather because the parents then make a rational calculation. It's better for their child to spend their evenings studying for the exam that will determine their life rather than training and dreaming of a utopian football career. But what's funny is that at one point in the early 2010s, almost at the same time, both countries actually took a step back and asked themselves, how is it that with such a large population, we can't manage to perform in football? That's not normal. We need to change things. And so, as I was saying, almost at the same time, both countries put in place ultra-ambitious plans to finally claim the place in football they believe they deserve. The brand new El Dorado of football is located in China.
The nation of China is undergoing a period of rapid and significant change. The pulsating rhythm of football is now taking hold.
When we look at the situation in China, this ambitious strategic plan ultimately boils down to one primary factor. It requires money, an absolutely staggering amount of capital investment that far exceeds initial expectations for the project. Because when the Chinese head of state, Xi Jinping, a football fan, decided in 2015 to launch a national plan to transform Chinese football, he didn't do things by halves. He clearly launched the biggest plan in the history of global sports, with the official goal of making China the best team in the world by 2050. And this will involve millions and millions and billions of dollars spent on building, as I mentioned earlier, academies and 70,000 fields to train nearly 30 million children. Football is even made mandatory in school curriculums. And it won't stop there, because at the same time, to speed things up and boost the Chinese enthusiasm for football, there are also massive public and private investments being made in the Chinese Super League, with frenzied recruitment of stars like Hulk in Shanghai for 60 million euros, Oscar for 65, and Carlos Tevez, who at the time was the highest paid player in the world at over 700,000 euros per week. In short, it was really completely crazy. Some media outlets began to say that China was going to completely overturn the world order of football to become a major power. In winter 2016, the national team boasted about bringing in 2006 World Cup winner Marcelo Lippi as coach for $28 million a year. During that transfer window, Chinese clubs spent more money than those in the Premier League. And what's crazy is that around the same time, India did almost the same thing. Well, they didn't have the same resources, but in 2014, when they launched the Indian Super League, they also had big ambitions. There are owners who are famous, like Sachin Tendulkar, the god of Indian cricket. There are also Bollywood stars. And right from the first season, some big names from European football landed in India, such as Del Piero, Robert Pires, Trezeguet, Anelka, and even Nesta. Legends certainly at the end of their careers, but legends nonetheless who will bring their popularity, who will generate excitement in India. Except, as you might guess, unfortunately, these two projects, as gigantic and ambitious as they were, ultimately didn't work at all. We often tend to forget this fact, but even if money can temporarily hide our problems for a while, unfortunately, it never truly solves them. And in this case, in China, the collapse would be as spectacular as it was brutal. In fact, the problem was that in the league, 10 out of 16 clubs were owned by real estate developers. And so when the real estate bubble bursts in China, everything will collapse like a house of cards. Chinese professional football will almost completely disappear. The reigning Chinese champion, Jiangsu FC, announced the complete cessation of its activities just 3 months after winning the title. The same goes for Guangzhou FC, two-time winner of the Asian Champions League, which will be relegated in 2022 and then dissolved completely in 2025. And yeah, actually everything will collapse at a crazy speed, not to mention the spectacular failure of the Chinese training model, an almost industrial system that didn't work at all for the reasons I explained to you earlier. And in India overall, it's going to be the same thing. Granted, the collapse will be a bit less spectacular, a bit less sudden than in China, but overall the result will be the same. Because this league and these franchises will never really catch on, they'll never truly attract a lot of people or be profitable. Often football clubs will be forced to play on fields shared with cricket teams. They end up in facilities that are unsuitable with ruined pitches. On top of that, the structure and model of Indian football need to be completely rethought. The youth leagues are fragmented and lack uniformity. The resources, the structure, the staff, or even the facilities to scout and train local talent are also negligible, which means that in such a vast country with such a huge population, the nation is unable to properly identify or even develop its talents. And so, apart from spending huge amounts of money to bring in stars from other countries, the teams are unable to get good players, and this does nothing to help the progress of the Indian national team.
Even though we are 1.5 billion people, we still don't win medals. People don't identify or nurture talent at the right time. The day we become a sporting nation where sports is one of the most important priorities. If you are 5 years old and you're good, you'll find the right people, the best in the country to work with you. And your data will be sent to the headquarters. If you do well, you'll be transferred indoors. It's an entire system. No good player whose talent has been missed.
Especially since, on top of that, there's something else I haven't mentioned yet, but which is nevertheless pervasive in football, as well as in sports and in the societal life of these two countries. It's the rampant endemic corruption that prevails there. There, whether in India or in China, truly, both football federations are completely weakened by corruption, which hinders the progress and structuring of football. For example, in 2019, Li Ti, the Chinese national team coach, admitted to having paid $10 million to the president of the federation and the secretary general to obtain the position of national coach. A president of the Chinese Football Federation who is currently serving a life sentence for having accepted several tens of millions of dollars in bribes. And in India, overall, it's the same thing. In fact, recently the federation and the national teams were excluded by FIFA due to political interference in the federation's operations. In short, if the social and economic context is already not at all favorable to the rise and development of football, as you've understood, the political and structural functioning of these two countries is also a major obstacle. And so it's all of this, all these reasons, this cocktail of bad decisions that brings us to the fact that today, the two most populous countries in the world, the two global giants representing nearly a quarter of the population with 2.8 billion people, have not qualified for the World Cups in 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018, 2022, and even 2026, despite a historic expansion of the number of participants from 32 to 48 teams, with teams like Curaçao or even Cape Verde managing to secure their coveted spot. And yeah, today, when you look back at the history of their two national teams, it's pretty surreal to realize that India and China, between them, have only a single World Cup appearance in 2002, as I mentioned earlier. And unfortunately, based on all the articles I've read, the podcasts, the studies, etc., I get the feeling that in the coming years, in the coming decades, there isn't much that could really turn things around.